Okay, one of the things that I wanted to do or prepare you for in class, on the class that we're missing next week while I'm in DC, is your site selection and your sample selection. We're putting a little bit cart before the horse on this because you're still, for your individual projects, you're still working on your questions and thinking and still thinking about which approach is best. But it's as you develop your projects, it's a good idea to kind of tack back and forth between the practical things that you have in your that you've been thinking about and the conceptual matters that you need to resolve as you write your proposal. So I'm just going to walk through this worksheet, and then I'll put the worksheet in our I'll link to it on our page. And what I would ask you to do is to listen along and be thinking about your project as we move through this. And I'm going to give you an example from a project that I did quite a number of years ago that's still kind of ongoing, just as one example. And hopefully we'll be able to find some other examples for site selection and participant selection as we go along. So we often rush to say, I'm going to interview, X number of people, and then here are my interview questions. And we don't really think through how those people are situated in a particular context of where they are. And we don't always think through exactly who have we chosen and are those the best choices. So the okay. So what is your field, or where is your site? Start really big and, practically speaking, work your way down in scope. So if you could go anywhere in the world to do your research, what continent and country and why? We often just get nation centric. We just assume, well, of course I'm doing my project here in the US. Well, why? Is this a US project? Does it not have international implications? Why haven't you chosen to do your project in Sri Lanka? Well, that wouldn't be convenient. Okay, so that raises the issue of convenience. Yes, sometimes we make choices because we're basically looking at something that's right next door, or what they call in our backyard. But the best case scenario would be to have a reason for choosing to study in the U.S. So, as you'll see in my case, I'm studying a U.S., very typically U.S. form of educational process and policy. I can't do that I can't answer those particular questions if I was studying in another country. Okay, so what continent and country? In my case, the U.S. What region, state, or city? Is this something that could happen anywhere in the country you've chosen? Or is it something that is an East Coast problem or a West Coast problem? Or is something that is that there's a very specific state policy, so the only place you could ask and answer these questions is in a particular state or a particular region, and why? What are the reasons for that? If you're asking the kind of question that really doesn't have a place, I'm thinking, for example, about the therapists crying. Maybe it really doesn't matter where that happens. In that case, you can go on to the who. But keep working through the where and context, because eventually you are going to have to figure out a site for your research. What kind of social institution have you chosen to study? In most of your cases, you're going to be studying education. But what level? So I've asked you in class, when you say you're studying students, well, what level? Are you studying elementary students, middle school, high school, college? And why did you make that choice? Why is your question appropriate for that kind of institution? Some of you may actually be going outside of school institutions into churches and medical institutions and so forth. What type? If you're studying a problem that happens in a medical institution, is it a clinic? Is it a hospital? Is it a doctor's office? Um, you know, make your choices about those and explain why that's the appropriate choice. It may seem obvious to you, but if you have to explain it, then you might actually hear another assumption that you need to be putting back into your research questions or your purpose. So within a social institution, if I was studying faculty, for example, and higher education, any faculty member, or am I narrowing it down to faculty in the College of Education? Or am I narrowing it down by discipline to soft and hard disciplines? And so I want to talk to faculty um, uh, in colleges that have soft, like social sciences, like education, that kind of thing. Uh, you can imagine if you were studying church youth groups, you might an institutional choice might be to decide whether or not you're going to study Christian or non-Christian um, organizations, those kinds of things. Keep going with social groups until you're down with the smallest group. So you've pretty much answered all the, like if you were to start off with the description of the group, you would have to back up. So if I am talking to someone and they say, well, yeah, I'm going to interview teachers, I'm going to interview math teachers about how they introduce fractions. Well, that statement doesn't tell me that the math teacher is going to be at the elementary level. Maybe they're actually interviewing math teachers at the high school level and they're talking about the way that fractions are introduced relative to calculus problems. I don't know. As a future audience, I need to know all those choices. So finally, in terms of where, think about it geographically in terms of boundaries. So who would, or we haven't talked about who yet, what would be inside this boundary and what would be outside of it? So let me walk through my example on where, and maybe it'll help bring this to light. So in this research project, I was interested in post-secondary educational aspirations among young people living in Central Appalachia. I'm going to go through a little bit of my logic on this, on the background for the study. The research was funded by the Appalachian Math Science Partnership, and so they were interested in getting more students in the pipeline to become math and science teachers. That was the goal of the grant. I had a mini project underneath that grant, so that's where some of the rationale comes from for the questions I'm asking. Appalachia is known for low post-secondary achievement and poverty, and so I'm studying, well, I'll go down to how I break it out. I'm studying in North America because North America has a math higher education system. So studying educational aspirations in North America is not interrupted by other structural obstacles to pursuing post-secondary. I'm studying in the Appalachian region because it's identified as a place where there is low post-secondary educational achievement, which is part one of my research design. I'm specifically choosing Eastern Kentucky because I needed to choose one state, and Eastern Kentucky as a state has the largest number of counties within the Appalachian region that fall into this very low educational achievement. I could have chosen West Virginia or Virginia, but so I might want to explain why I didn't choose West Virginia, for example. That might come down to convenience. In my case, I'm working under the Appalachian Math Science Partnership, and the partnership boundaries were in Kentucky. They didn't have West Virginia counties, so that solves my problem there. I couldn't do West Virginia under the grant that I was on. Okay. So one of my arguments in my rationale for my research is that Appalachia has diversity within it, that it isn't one homogeneous economic space, And so that gave me the rationale that I wanted to look for communities within the state region, Eastern Kentucky, that were economically different or positioned in economically different ways, following a theory of center and periphery. Center being the place where banks and hospitals are located, periphery being the place where typically people work and live, but they have to use the center to get their to basically to transform their work into something that they can use. In other words, their paycheck comes from the center, but they may work in the periphery, that kind of thing. Okay, sorry, too much of my work. But that explains why I needed two communities. So I chose two high schools. Um, High schools are where post-secondary aspirations get turned into actions. So if I want to study youth aspirations, high schools are good places to do it. I could have gone to a different institution, and it would be interesting to see if I had done a similar study where I had only talked to, let's say, church youth group members of a certain age. That I could have pursued my questions with that in that space. But high schools is typically where college decisions are played out, the actions are played out. So I chose two high schools, one in a center community and one in a periphery community. Um, I didn't mention which county I had chosen, but basically I went through all of the counties in the region that I had chosen, and I looked at the schools, and I was looking for a county that had both a, a city school and a county school. Some of the counties were too small, they didn't have two, and narrowed it down to a few counties that had that center periphery structure, and then in that case, and then I looked for, you'll see in the next part, I wanted schools that had clear college, they were making progress on college going. And so there was one county that had a periphery school that had been making slow but steady increases every year. So they were obviously a healthy school, and the center school I didn't have to choose because there was only the one. Okay, so now I have my two schools. So that's my where. And I don't think that there's anything. So in my methodology, in my proposal, and then in my methodology, when I write up the research, I explain all those decisions to get the reader to understand why I am in the space that I'm in. This will help later on when I'm doing analysis and explaining what I find, because I can refer back to some of these decisions as maybe being part of the explanation for the results that I'm getting. If I didn't go through this process, then there might be some holes in the logic that I produce later. Okay, so now that I know where, who, let's back up to your project. So of all the people in the world with whom you interact to generate data, or of all the people in the world, with whom will you interact to generate data? Who do you need to talk to? Who do you need to be with in order to generate data that's going to help you answer the questions that you've laid out? What are their demographic characteristics? Gender, race, age, sexuality, anything having to do with their personhood. What are their experiential traits? Are they, are they teachers with 5 years of experience, or are they brand new first semester teachers? Are they, I can't think of any examples, so it's horrible. Anyway, so you're looking for people that have particular experiences that define who they are, because you want them to tell you about those experiences, especially if you're doing phenomenological research. What positions do they hold in the social group that you've chosen? So if you are studying a case study of an organization, you need to think about who in that organization will you need to talk to in order to understand the organization. What positions, not necessarily the who in terms of their names, but what positions do you need to make sure to cover? Um, Now, emergent design means that down the line you might modify this and choose more people, but this is in the proposal stage where you're having to imagine um, what you might do, and so you don't have the benefit of having already been in the field yet. Um, no decision is completely obvious. Every decision won't have to be explained in detail. So if your research question says that you're looking at how young girls learn chemistry, then clearly you're going to be talking to girls and not to boys. But maybe not. Maybe you're interested in the differences between them. So this is one of those cases where by defining exactly who it is you're going to talk to in order to generate or to be with in terms of participant observation, in order to generate data, um, it also is asking you to clarify what your research purpose and questions are. You may find that you need to go back and clarify those. That's why we're doing this exercise now. So for my study, I had these two high schools, and I wanted to learn about college aspirations. So I wanted a representation of the seniors in this high school who were all about the same age, so I didn't have to worry about age. I wanted to talk to both men and women, and because the nature of the grant I was under was interested in the pursuit of STEM majors, I also wanted to talk to students who were interested in studying STEM fields and non-STEM fields when they got to college. And I also knew that family post-secondary achievement matters to educational aspirations. So I wanted to make sure to talk to students who came from families who had gone to college, and also to talk to students who had come from families who had not gone to college, first generation. They would be first generation college students. Um, so for my approach, I knew I wanted to talk to I wanted a variety of perceptions and experiences. Um, you'll see that my research is ethnographic at times, but I wasn't doing an ethnography or case study, so I didn't need to include I wasn't including everybody in a cultural space or in the case. I was picking students for very specific reasons. So at each of the high schools, I worked with a guidance counselor to identify all the students in the senior class who are planning on going to college. And I focused on those who said in their senior survey, which they filled out in the fall of their senior year, I focused on those who said that they wanted to get a baccalaureate. This was to narrow the pool to those who were planning on a professional or a paraprofessional degree as opposed to two-year vocational training. I have a longer explanation in my lit review and so forth for why I was doing that. At the center school, at the high school that was in the city, all but two of the students in the class of 85 students were planning on going on for a baccalaureate. At the periphery school out in the county, only 25% of actually it was 45 seniors were planning on a baccalaureate. So in one school I had a pool of 83 students to choose from, and the other I had 10. And then on their senior survey, they also indicated what they wanted to major in, and so I used that to sort them into STEM and non-STEM degree plans. I then went through all of these students with the guidance counselors to figure out what their parent education level is. These are tiny little high schools, and everybody knows everybody. So typically the guidance counselor was able to go down and say, yes, his dad is a doctor, so he has a medical degree. Her mom is a nurse. Her mom stays at home with the babies, but I know that she went to community college, and so forth and so on, until we had figured out at least a rough idea of the educational experience of the parents of all the students. Sometimes that included asking people walking down the hall, which was a little bit awkward. Anyway, and then that broke down into, did they graduate from high school or not? Did they go to college or not? If they went to college, did they finish a 2-year degree or a bachelor's degree? And if they fit and or a graduate degree. And then because I had so many students in the city school whose parents had a bachelor's degree, I also noticed that there was a difference between those who had what I think of as service professions, teaching, nursing, law enforcement, which are very popular in rural regions because there are jobs in civil service. So we separated those out from the professional or other uh, uh, college experience, which might include business, for example. So I created a matrix of all those variables and put the students into that matrix. And I recruited at the periphery high school, there were only the 10 students, so I recruited all of them. Ended up with 9, and then one dropped out. I ended up with 8 of them. But I still plotted them on the matrix for their group so that I could compare it with the other group. And then I did the same thing for the, it was 83 um, city school students on the matrix. The only other decision I made in selecting my participants was that there were some students in the city school whose families were not from the region. They had moved into the area in most cases because their parents had gotten on at the hospital. And in many of these cases, they were not Native American. I mean, they were not native of the region, and they were from other countries, although the children had grown up in the U.S. So I took them out because this is a study of Appalachian aspirations, and I have a strong, it's part of my rationale was that the Appalachian experience affects aspirations in different ways. And so these families weren't from Appalachia, and so I did not include those students. And of course, I didn't include the students who weren't planning on going to college for a baccalaureate. So here's what it looks like. From the periphery high school, I plotted out everybody in the whole class. Only 10 of these ended up being planning on a baccalaureate degree, and I recruited all of them. But this gives you an idea of the parental education level. Most of their parents did finish high school. There were only a few who had dropped out. But most of their parents only had a high school degree or some college, mostly community college, and only one of the seniors had a parent who had a bachelor's degree. In the center school, this is only including the students who were in my pool. I had already taken out the students who I was not including. And you can see where they're much more distributed. There were no high school dropouts. There were some who had not gone to college at all, but most were college educated in the different areas, and some with professional graduate training. Okay, so that tells you, and then so what I would do is that, like, say from this non-STEM group of 17 students whose parents had professional training, I would randomly pick one of them, or I would basically just randomly pick one, recruit that student. If they were willing to participate, great. If not, I would go on to the next, just randomly, and likewise in the different categories. So I did not have a student from every single category. I basically had 8 students, one from each non-STEM, professional, STEM, professional, and so forth. Yeah. Okay. So finally, you have where you're going to do your work. You have who you're going to talk to or be with. And you also need to clarify when you're going to generate data. Is there anything time sensitive about your field site or the experiences of the people in it? Is there a semester schedule? Is there an event that happens? Anything that is on a calendar that has a beginning and an end date that you have to arrange your research to be able to capture. If you're using an ethnographic approach, is there a clear cultural cycle that you can follow? Most traditional ethnographies talk about being in the field site for at least a year, because it takes a whole year for human beings to go through all the various things that we do over our cultural cycle because of the seasons. Now that's a little traditional and outdated, obviously, because we're not as season bound anymore. But think about it. We have the holidays in the wintertime. We have summer vacation plans. We have reactions to athletic schedules that occur in different seasons. So even though we're not crop cultivating as a whole society anymore, we do have seasons. And so if you're doing ethnography, you want to be there for all the seasons in a cycle. For those of us who study education, that typically means looking at the school calendar and making sure that we're present enough within a school calendar to capture the nuances. If you remember, if you think about it, the first day of school is a very different cultural experience than the final weeks of a semester or the weeks during which there's standardized testing going on. If you only showed up on one of those days, you would definitely not get the culture of the school. Okay, so another thing to think about is if your questions are asking people to think about the past, then you also need to make sure that your methodology is considering the fact that they are remembering as opposed to telling, and depending on how long ago it was, you may need to do a little bit of reading about memory and nostalgia and the way that people recall events, just so that you can understand the kind of data that you're getting. Narrative inquiry uses this kind of memory a lot, and so there's actually narrative research has more discussion of that than some of the other approaches. Are you asking about change over time? Are you asking about something that what happens to individuals over a period of time? If so, and you're not asking about them to remember in the past, you may actually be designing a longitudinal study that in which you're going to generate data at different time intervals as people have certain experiences. You'll need to figure out what those time intervals are and why you've chosen them. So for my study, I spent the fall semester of the students' senior year at their high schools doing participant observation. I pretty much talked to everybody I ran into. I did not have, they were all informal conversations with the exception of the guidance counselors who I was working with and their principals. I talked to, teachers in the lunchroom. I talked to parents at football games. I went to a lot of football games. It's the best way to get open access to a whole community of people without them really wondering why you're there. Just be careful what color you wear. And I talked to some students if they happened to be waiting in the hall while I was waiting in the hall and chatted with them. I talked to anybody who'd be able to tell me about what going to college meant in that school. This was the first phase of the research. It was background to my interviews, and it was while I was doing my participant selection process with the guidance counselors. In terms of timing, I wanted to interview them in the spring of their senior year after they had applied to college. So I knew that they had definitely applied to college, but because I had a lot of data generation to do, I had to do it earlier in the spring. I couldn't wait until they had gotten their acceptance letters from their colleges. So I did most of the first interviews with all of the students in February and March. My design, which I won't go into here, also meant that I talked to the best friend of each of the students and also to the significant adult in their life. Usually, I'll try to cut that. So I interviewed the students in February, March. So I could have just stopped there, but I find that I was curious, and everyone that I talked to about this research project was curious about what happened to them. Where did they go? Did they go to college? What ended up happening? So I also did follow-up interviews in the first year of college with about half of them that I was able to get a hold of. And I was able to touch base with most of them through Facebook in that first year. And then I've continued to keep in touch with a few students from each class. So I'm actually continuing to generate data with the students, which is meant I've had to re-up my IRB regularly. And I actually rewrote a proposal for longitudinal research and got new IRB approval with the smaller group of people that I was corresponding with more regularly. And that's where I ended up. It's been 8 years since they graduated. And I bet you want to know what happened to them. Story for another day. Okay, so go back through your project and figure out where your research will take place and why. Really explore that question. Once you have the setting, figure out who within that setting you're going to talk to or be with in order to generate data. And then also consider when, at what time in the year, over what length of time, and be considerate of the timing of the data that you are asking people to share. So if they are sharing memories, be considerate of that. And that will help you start to think more deeply about the decisions that you're making for your proposal. Thank you.